The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are interested in what happened when those Jews that had been exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem were able to return to the land, to Jerusalem, and to the land they'd formerly inhabited. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very interested in the what of this situation. They're interested in what happened, the rebuilding of the altar, the reconstruction of the temple, very importantly, and the reconstruction of that great wall around Jerusalem, which was so important. But they're also very interested in the trials and tribulations of the community as they returned, the difficulties and the challenges they faced, but also the blessings, the tribulations, but also the celebrations. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very interested in not just the what, but the who. Ezra and Nehemiah, great leaders of the Jewish people returning to the land, but also other leaders, Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, in the first wave of returnees. The Persian kings who presided over the restoration and the return, Cyrus the Great, Darius, Artaxerxes, other great Persian kings. First and foremost, though, I think the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are interested in the part that God himself played in the restoration. And that's important for Ezra and Nehemiah, and then ultimately the people who pulled together these sources into the book that we know as Ezra and Nehemiah. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very much interested in the where, not just the where of imperial Persia, Susa, and Babylon, but then also, as the books move on, very much interested in the where of Jerusalem and the province of Yehud. They're interested in the when, in fixing this return in time and space. They're interested in precise dates. In the 7th year of the king Artaxerxes, one of the phases of the return took place. They're interested, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, in the how and the why of this return. And not just the part that the Persian kings played, not just the part that Ezra and Nehemiah played in this restoration, but, as I've said, the part that God plays in the restoration, the part that he plays in superintending and orchestrating events, sometimes behind the scenes, in order to facilitate this return to their homeland. The background to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah begins with the Babylonians. The Babylonians in 586 arrived in Judea and at Jerusalem and wreaked terrible devastation on both of them. The city itself was taken. The Jerusalem temple was destroyed, and the city was sacked. And most significantly for the Jewish people, leaders within the community were taken and deported to the land of Babylon, displaced from their home and their people, and left in a very different and very strange country. This was a terrible trauma for the people, both the people who had been deported, but also the people left behind. And we hear something of the anxiety, we hear something of the emotion of that terrible event in the book of Lamentations that we find in our Old Testament. But the power of the Babylonians was destined not to last, thanks to the rise of the Persians, and specifically their king, their first great king, Cyrus the Great, who, after gradually rising from relative obscurity, eventually took the capital of Babylon in 539. Most significantly for the Jewish people, the rise of Cyrus the Great meant the return, or the possibility of return, for them as a people. This policy of the restoration of local religion and local communities in the provinces of the Persian Empire, we find referenced in an artifact, an ancient artifact that was taken out of the sand, the Cyrus cylinder. We read of this return policy in the Cyrus cylinder, but we also read about it at the very beginning of the book of Ezra. This policy was, of course, crucial in facilitating the return of the Jewish people to their homeland in various waves. First, under Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, then again under Ezra and Nehemiah during the time of King Artaxerxes. A very significant time for the Jewish people, for Ezra and Nehemiah. In addition to the Judeans, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are very interested in others, like the Sumerians and Tobiah, the Ammonite, for instance, those who were opposed to the reconstruction of Jerusalem, the reconstruction of the temple, partly because they were aware of the loss of influence they would have to endure if the efforts of the returnees were successful. And we have some evidence of Sanballat, somebody mentioned by name within the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We have some evidence of Sanballat from ancient Egyptian records, which have eventually come to light. And so we have a sense that this is a book, these are two books which are very much rooted in time and space, very much rooted in the history of the Persian period. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as we have them today, are composed of, as we see it now, various bits of and kinds of literature. First and foremost, Ezra and Nehemiah are composed of, very interestingly, the memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah. We don't often find in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament the autobiographical voice, the I of the autobiography, and yet we do find that here in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Very interestingly, not all of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are autobiographical, but we find autobiographical material in chapters 8 and 9 in Ezra, for instance, and in the book of Nehemiah in chapters 1 and 2, chapters 4 and 5, and indeed also in chapters 12 and 13 as well, in addition to other areas. So it's very interesting and helpful to hear this memoir material because though some scholars will debate how much of the material, whether there are some bits of the material that may have been added by other people, most scholars, I think, would agree that most of the material we find in these chapters, which is spoken in the autobiographical voice of Ezra and Nehemiah, really do go back to their memoirs. And thus they provide us with a very real, very vivid, and in many cases very helpful perspective on what was taking place in their time and in their place. In addition to the memoir material or autobiographical material, we have in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah what seem to be correspondence and documents from the Persian Empire. Actual correspondence, actual documents relating to Jerusalem, relating to the province, the Persian province of Yehud. What's also very interesting about this correspondence, this documentation, is that it's preserved not in Hebrew, the language which is characteristic of the rest of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but in Aramaic, the language of the Persian Empire, the lingua franca of the time. And the fact that these documents, these pieces of writing are in Aramaic really does give them a ring of authenticity. And it's very interesting, very helpful to see these documents included in the book because it gives us a sense of what the author, what the final compiler of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah was interested in. That is, he was very interested in giving the reader a real sense of the historical rootedness of what was transpiring. In addition to the memoirs, in addition to the documents, contemporary documents in Aramaic from the Persian Empire, we also have great lists, long lists of all kinds of things, including long lists of people. Sometimes we may wonder why the writer, the compiler of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, was so interested in including these lists of people, often the people who have returned to the land. Occasionally we see lists of people who, for instance, were involved in an inter-community controversy surrounding divorce and intermarriage. We find lists of people who effectively signed up to the covenant which the leaders of the community were calling them to sign up to. These lists, while not very interesting sometimes for many of us as modern readers, were obviously very, very important to the person who compiled Ezra and Nehemiah eventually, partly because we have the sense that the identity of the people was very important. And many of these lists emphasize the continuity of these people with their forefathers, those who had been exiled and come to Babylon, so as to establish and reaffirm their continuity, the continuity of those returning, with those who had lived in Judah and in Jerusalem before the exile. For many years, many scholars, most scholars I think, assumed that the person who was responsible for bringing together all these various bits, the memoirs, the lists, the imperial documentation, bringing it all together, that the person responsible for that was the chronicler, the person responsible for the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The reason that scholars were relatively persuaded by that was that, in a very real sense, the book of Ezra picks up where the book of 2nd Chronicles leaves off, carries the story on from where the book of 2nd Chronicles leaves off. And not only that, but also the chronicler's style has some similarities to what we see particularly in the book of Ezra. Indeed, the chronicler's great interest, not quite abiding passion, is lists, as anybody who has read the books of Chronicles will know. And so there is a real resonance with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, its own interest in various lists and in the identity of the people. I think in recent years, it's probably safe to say that scholars are beginning to see not just the similarities between Ezra and Nehemiah and the books of Chronicles, but also the differences, increasingly the differences. And so scholars have noted the language used, the phraseology, the turn of phrase used by the chronicler is in some ways quite different from the turn of phrase which we find in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Also, I think it's true to say that the interests of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are not always the same as the books of Chronicles. For instance, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are very interested in the dangers, the temptations, and the consequences of not remaining separate, and very interested in the dangers particularly of intermarriage with the peoples around the community. It's, I think, safe to say that that is not really on the radar screen of the chronicler, the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so for these and other reasons, scholars are less confident now than they were before that the chronicler was the author or the compiler of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That leaves us with the question of who then was responsible. And unfortunately, the author of Ezra and Nehemiah did not sign his work. And that leaves us with questions as to who might have done this. Ultimately, those aren't questions that we're very well positioned to answer. But we do have some sense, because of the nature of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the admixture of documents, of memoirs, of lists, that the author, whoever he or she, probably he, was very interested in rooting the events of the return in the historical time and place of the Persian Empire, and therefore gives us a great deal of detail.